When speaking about slow violence, I think it's helpful to begin with some examples. So, you may or may not know, but the leading cause of death in the United States is heart disease. So, the CDC estimates that some 659,000 people die every year from heart disease. So, that comes out to about 1 out of 4 deaths. And heart disease is largely preventable by getting exercise, by not smoking, and by eating a healthy diet. And so when we're talking about this, it's interesting maybe to compare COVID and the current pandemic, which actually we've exceeded the figure of 659,000 people dead in the United States due to the pandemic. Of course, that's over now a couple of years. But and maybe that's not a surprising number, though it still feels pretty catastrophic. But what's interesting here is that the number of 659,000 people who die of heart disease, which is almost, that's an incredible number of people, it's not really represented. In the media, it may not even be common knowledge. The causes of heart disease may not even be common knowledge. So it doesn't even seem to be part of kind of the ecology of knowledge in the United States, even though it's this pretty catastrophic thing. These are a lot of deaths. And so I think heart disease is then related to the way in which food industries sort of saturate public knowledge, but also public behavior. So the things that people eat. So if it's really highly processed, if there are a lot of animal products, a lot of cholesterol, then we're talking about having a predisposition towards heart disease, right? If there aren't enough opportunities for nutritious food, like in food deserts and in certain parts of the city, then this is already, we're thinking ecologically, like we're thinking of it within a context, or not very many opportunities or places to be active and to have exercise. And we can also think of, sort of the peddling of smoking, of cigarettes, which increasingly is being, tobacco companies are peddling them out into so-called developing nations around the world, because less people are smoking in developed so-called developed countries. But this is again an instance of like what I'm going to call, and what's been called, media ecology. So like the images and the information that we're steeped in on a daily basis. Not so long ago, cigarettes, which are known class 1 carcinogenic, carcinogen, it was just, something to be sold and enjoyed and advertised, right? The same could be said for processed meat and red meat and likely other forms of meat, which are now known to be, like cigarettes, known carcinogens. And so here we're talking about two things. So deaths that really are not glamorous, they're not even talked about that much, and also this sort of media ecology that almost incubates these diseases. So this would be the start of a long conversation about human health and slow violence. Another example is a recent story in The Guardian. There's a journal called Environmental Science and Technologies, which just published a study letting us know that forever chemicals, PFAS, are now found in 20% of private wells and 60% of public wells. And they sampled wells from 16 different states on the eastern seaboard of the United States. And these forever chemicals have been linked to cancer, birth defects, liver disease, thyroid disease, compromised immunity, hormone disruption, and all these other serious health problems. And they're dubbed forever chemicals because they don't really break down naturally, and they move around in the environment. They move around through the food chain, and they often end up in drinking water. And so these are diseases and a public health issue that isn't like immediately catastrophic, like spectacularly catastrophic. There's not like one thing that you can say becomes a touchstone issue to be reported or thought about. But this is very diffuse. It's almost even hard to grasp the fact that these forever chemicals are basically going everywhere and compromising our human health. And in bringing up this example, I think it's really important to go back to the statistics of what they found. So on the one hand, everyone is contaminated by it, by these forever chemicals. But you may have noted in what I quoted before, only 20% of private wells and 60% of public wells have these forever chemicals, at least according to the research in this study. So this tells us that there's a disproportionate impact on public facilities, which very likely means then there's a disproportionate impact on middle to lower class and impoverished people who depend on public water. So this is another example of slow violence. And the two I've given so far, heart disease and these forever chemicals, are very contemporary. But we could go back into like a somewhat more historical event, I suppose, though it's not that far back really, Vietnam. And this is a work by Martha Rosler called B-52 in Baby's Tears from 1972. So the height of the Vietnam War, at least the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. And in this work by Rob Nixon, his book called Slow Violence, which we're going to talk about in a moment, he quotes the New York Times. And he says, this came from a story in the New York Times from 2003. And the New York Times says that in Vietnam, quote, during our dozen years there, the U.S. killed and helped kill at least 1.5 million people. So that seems like an innocent enough statement. Maybe not innocent, but just like clear, right? Okay, it was a catastrophic war. Vietnam forever changed the landscape of what it meant for the U.S. to go into war and what it meant to have a good war and all these things. And 1.5 million people were killed. But what Nixon points out is that, okay, fine, that's within those 12 years where technically that war that was being fought, that the U.S. was intervening in Vietnam. But Nixon points out, but what about all the deaths that came as a result from this war, not from immediate bombing, not from killing with weapons, but what about all the much slower, drawn-out deaths and long-lasting generational trauma that continue to unfold to this day? And so he points out the example of Agent Orange, which is a really noxious defoliant that would take away trees. They would drop it so that trees would die, so that there wouldn't be as many hiding places for the so-called enemy army. But this is an incredibly toxic thing, Agent Orange. And it led to all sorts of diseases and birth defects and so on and so forth, which again continue to this day. So whereas the war itself is this really catastrophic, spectacular thing that some people think of within the span of 12 years, and it's part of history and part of documentaries and so on and so forth, and people study military history. And yet, what about all those deaths that are that were less direct, and that were drawn out through disease and through contamination and through pollution, as an example, Agent Orange, or even the lasting effects of dropping napalm on the environment, right? What about the sort of longer-lasting, generational, slower forms of violence? So this is another example, and this is why I give you this work by Martha Rosler, It's this bed of shrubbery with the outline, the silhouette of a B-52, which of course it would be B-52s and other fighter planes that would be dropping this stuff onto the Vietnam countryside. And so in this work, it looks like, Agent Orange or napalm has been deployed here, and it's just scorched the earth. But again, Rob Nixon's point is that we should also be thinking what happened after the war was deemed to be over, and all the ramifications of military and chemical intervention on the environment. And then, of course, maybe the biggest example of slow violence, which is a central theme of our class, is global warming and the temporality of greenhouse gases, which again, methane is going to stay in the atmosphere for a few decades. It's the fastest. It's the fastest to burn away, whereas carbon dioxide will last for centuries, right? Will last much longer. And this is so broad and diffuse, right? It's almost hard to even grasp what it means to have an atmosphere that has more and more greenhouse gases, which means the world, everything in the world itself, the planet itself, is getting warmer and warmer and warmer. It's almost hard to kind of localize and pinpoint in one place and in one time, because we're dealing with really long spans of time, and we're really dealing with a really diffuse sense of space, because really it's everywhere. And there's a risk of them thinking that since it's everywhere, it's nowhere. But that only works as sort of a trick of language. That's not at all the reality of global warming. We have to think in different terms if we're gonna start to think about this form of violence, which is on intergenerational timescales and super diffuse, right? And so those were just 4 examples of slow violence. And now I'd like to just turn to maybe a more exact definition, which will allow us to sort of group everything together of these 4 examples, see that we could come up with sadly almost endless examples of slow violence, and then also understand what the stakes are, and what the challenges are living in a world with so much slow violence. So like I said before, the term slow violence comes from Rob Nixon and this wonderful book that he wrote in 2011 called Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. I highly recommend reading this book. It is excellent, and provides all sorts of tools for our arsenal in order to think through and hopefully contest environmental degradation. And so how would we approach this? What are some of the ways in which we'd want to kind of give a nice definition of slow violence so that we can understand how to use it, and how to approach it, and how to find it, and how to see it? And so there's this wonderful quote on page 8 that I wanted to pull out for you. He says that violence, above all environmental violence, needs to be seen and deeply considered as a contest not only over space or bodies or labor or resources, but also over time. And so this is what I was saying through my first 4 examples before, that often violence is thought to be this very sudden thing. Like maybe the opposite of slow violence is fast violence, like getting stabbed or getting shot or getting blown up, or seeing explosions and so on and so forth. Violence is often thought to be sort of like this instantaneous traumatic thing, which of course it can be, and it is. But Nixon's point is to think through the ways in which violence doesn't work in that way, the way in which violence can sort of seep, the way it can sort of be very slow and glacial. We have the glacier melting in the background of this slide. So that time is much more glacial. It's not a sudden thing that we can sort of encapsulate. It's a much more long, durational type of event. And so we shouldn't only consider like where violence happens, or to whom violence happens, or with what violence happens, but also what is the span of time? What time encompasses violence? And his point, which I think is a wonderful one, and very useful, is to say that sometimes it's incredibly long. It can be years, it can be decades, it can be centuries that this type of violence unfolds and continually affects and inflicts certain people. And when we're talking about global warming, all of us, right? And so this is, I think I was more or less encapsulating this next line. It says, this is because in contrast to fast and spectacular violence, and we're going to get to a moment what I mean by spectacular here. I don't mean spectacular in the, oh, it's great. I mean spectacular in the sense of the spectacle. We'll talk about it in a second. But he says, and here I'm paraphrasing him, he says, this is because in contrast to fast and spectacular violence, certain forms of violence unfold over years or generation or even centuries. And so here's where we get to, this is where we're going to pivot towards art making and activism. Because if now we understand how slow violence works and what it is, then what sort of challenges does it pose to us? And slow violence definitely poses a challenge to the process of visualization, of making art, and more generally to the process of storytelling. And this is so for at least two reasons. The first, and here I quote him again, and this is from page 3 from Rob Nixon's Slow Violence. He asked the question, which I think is our essential question for today. How can we convert into image and narrative the disasters that are slow-moving and long in the making, disasters that are anonymous and that star nobody, disasters that are attritional and of indifferent interest to the sensation-driven technologies of our image world? And I think we could spend quite a bit of time unpacking this sentence, and I'd invite you to unpack this sentence maybe in your writings for this week, and when we get together in class. Basically, the rest of this session, the examples I give you and what I discuss, is an effort to unpack what he's saying here on page 3. And the second reason, and this is also really important to underscore, the second reason why slow violence poses challenges to visualization and storytelling, like I was talking about before with those forever chemicals, slow violence disproportionately affects the poor, who are rarely represented and often remain ignored. And so the difficulties of visibility, of making visible, of representing, or representing oneself goes even deeper, because then not only is the violence itself slow and attritional and diffuse, that it doesn't have like one meme-like event for us to sort of confront the violence, but those who are inflicted by slow violence already are disproportionately unrepresented in politics, in society, in the media, and so on and so forth, right? So I hope you can see how slow violence here is a challenge for this twofold, in this twofold way. And this is exactly why he calls his book Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. Because this difficult to narrate and difficult to visualize slow violence is endemic to poverty, and it usually affects the poor much more than those who are well off and have the means to protect themselves in more ways than those who don't have those means. So here's a work that tells us something more about fast violence and the way in which fast violence, as opposed to slow violence, is much more immediately representable. It can go viral. It can have a meme quality. I suppose these are all sort of more contemporary ways of thinking about it. But the essential thing is that a fast violence or sudden violent traumatic events become mediated by images and by technology in a way that's incredibly fast. And so there's a work by Hans-Peter Feldman. It's called 912 from Front Page, 2001. And it's the title describes exactly what it is. It's the front page of every single newspaper the day after 9/11 in 2001, all of them presented in the gallery one by one. And still, this is, Here's just like an up close of it. So like different language, different newspapers from different parts of the world, the front page news. And of course, on that day, on 9/12, the images of these horrible images of the towers being hit by these two planes, and then ultimately a few hours later collapsing. Those images were on every single, basically every single newspaper front page, and still, this was the most photographed, the most documented event in world history. And so it obviously became this event, this violent event. Many people say that it began a completely new era, and it certainly did bring the era of the so-called War on Terror, and the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, which we're still dealing with the fallout of those events. So it was incredibly consequential as a moment. And would be, Rob Nixon actually, I don't think, ever uses the term fast violence, but this was a violent moment. 3,000 people died, that just became incredibly visible. Okay, the world was saturated with this event. Now, the question to ask ourselves then is, what about, and I don't like using this term, what about, for reasons that I think I'm going to explain and we can talk about. But I think it's hard not to think about all the disasters that may have been happening right at that same time, or that are a result, maybe not so direct, but maybe somewhat direct, that are a result of this event and the war on terror. So what about, for example, the current tragedy that's unfolding in Afghanistan, and famine on a scale that's frightening, right? In which many more people are going to die or are imperiled through famine than 3,000 people who perished in the towers. And this is where I get very uncomfortable when people start to talk about what about. It's a fallacy called whataboutism. So if someone comes along and says, "Oh yeah, 3,000 people died in the tower, but what about these millions of people who are dying in a famine?" I feel like that's pitting two different violent moments and traumatic moments against themselves. Like it becomes this contest of numbers. And of violence to outmatch violence. And I feel like that's never very helpful at all. And so if I mention, let's say, famine in Afghanistan and the fact that it really is an impending tragedy on a monumental scale, that doesn't take away from other events that maybe there's less of a so-called body count, but that are much more visible. So there was almost nothing in world history as visible as the towers collapsing. On the one hand, on the other hand, there are these other traumatic events like famine, which happened before, during, and since the year 2001, that are not as traumatic in the media landscape, right? Because they're not as represented. And so I want us to think when we're thinking, and so this is an example of slow violence, right? Famine is an example of slow violence. It's a horrible, not very glamorous or like media-rich image to have thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people slowly dying from malnutrition and from famine. It's not as spectacular as two towers exploding and ultimately falling in on themselves, right? This is what I mean by spectacular, spectacle. News, our media landscape thrives on spectacle, on spectacular imagery. Whereas the things that happen in the world that aren't spectacular, they're kind of mundane, they don't get as well represented. They don't have as much of a say within the space of visibility. And so when we're talking about slow violence, I'd like us to keep in mind that there are at least two ecologies that are superimposed that are actually very different. So the first, of course, is the so-called natural ecology, right? Ecosystems, environment, landscape, rivers, pollution, all the greenhouse gases, the atmosphere. That's the ecology in the materialist sense, right? Or those forever plastics, for plastics, microplastics, or forever chemicals that are everywhere, right? That's thinking in terms of natural ecology, and that's usually where slow violence resides. But then there's also a media ecology, which us living in the United States, circa 21st century, we're steeped in media ecology. Online, on television, podcasts, so on and so forth. Our media ecology is incredibly fast. You probably know this. You've probably heard someone talk about attention issues and our things becoming increasingly difficult for us to concentrate because everything is moving so fast. Everything is a meme. Everything is viral. Everything flashes and then dies down super fast, right? So we live within a media ecology that then thrives on more sensational and more spectacular events, and some of them are incredibly stupid, like stories that go viral. I remember a few years back this dress where people couldn't decide what color it was, which everyone was talking about, right? Or images of violence, and sadly within the media ecology also misinformation and harmful information. They now know, sociologists have studied this, they know that it travels faster, it becomes more viral than accurate information, or more patient forms of thinking and being thoughtful. So when we're talking about slow violence, I want us to keep these two ecologies in mind. The time of media ecology, which is super fast, and stop and think of how it makes you think, of what are the ways in which the media ecology that you tap into from morning to night, how does that make you think about the world? What kind of access does it provide to the world? But what are the ways in which it doesn't give you access to reality and to the world? So on the one hand, media ecology, and on the other hand, natural ecology, right? The environment, pollution, greenhouse gases, and everything in between. And so let's go through. Feldman's work is an example of how fast violence works and how spectacular violence works. And like we were saying, slow violence is something very, very, very different. It's not dramatic. It unfolds over a long span of time. And there's a touchstone text in environmentalism, which was the first to really successfully, maybe not the first, but one of the first. Stories and books to narrate the damage of slow violence in a way that became really compelling. And this is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring from 1962. In many ways, this book is represents the beginning of modern environmental movements, especially in the United States. And the title Silent Spring had to do with birds no longer being as loud because they were dying, along with all sorts of other animals and ecosystems because of the spraying of DDT. DDT is incredibly, it's a pesticide that's incredibly toxic. And so Rachel Carson was one of the first to really narrate and tell the story of DDT, which again, it takes time, it's diffuse, it's a form of slow violence in such a way that became compelling within the sort of the collective mindset. So much so that, again, this is probably the beginnings of the modern environmental movement in the United States. So this could be one example, an early example of a book that compellingly tells the story and represents slow violence and sort of meets the challenge of slow violence. But what about artists? So from around the same time, Hans Haacke, he did this work called Rhine Water Purification Plant, where he took water from a nearby river, the Rhine, which was polluted, was near industry, and he filtered it within the gallery, so that fish in this large tank wouldn't die, would be able to live. And so here Haka is giving a sense of visibility, if only a portion, of industrial waste within waterways as a work of art, right? So this is not telling a story in a book, but it's telling a story in an installation in a gallery. So this is one possible way to maybe meet the challenges of the slow violence of pollution. We can go to more contemporary works as well. I had a hard time in some ways in this session because there are just so many examples of artists sort of thematizing slow violence in a way that sort of makes it immediate for us, right? Because in some ways, when you think of pollution, you think of it, oh yeah, it's out there somewhere. It's hard to, you can't really see it. And it's really just Mexico City and Sao Paulo and Beijing. And, New York City is relatively pollution free. And so like, there's this way in which we can risk falling into this sort of safe distance, which I think is wrong on a number of levels. And so this Belgian artist, Peter de Couperet, he's an olfactory artist. So olfactory means it's our sense of smell, the way we smell the world. He uses a lot of scents and smells in his works. And this is a wonderful installation called Smoke Cloud. So imagine walking into a gallery and all you see is in the center this ladder, and on the ceiling is what seems to be this cloud, this suspended cloud. And a really beautiful cloud, right? This lovely sort of cloud. I don't know my cloud type, so this might be a type of cloud. But in any case, it's this very beautiful, billowy, sort of pillowy kind of cloud. And it's a work that's meant to be interactive. So, and you would know this. So you would go to the ladder, you would step onto it, and you would put your head in the clouds. I love this imagery, because of course we all know that if someone says you have your head in the clouds, it means you're not aware, you're not thinking about what's going on or your surroundings. And he's turning that on its head, because when you do put your head in the clouds, then you realize that he's suffused this cloud with the smell of pollution, the smell of toxic pollution. So you put your head up there, and then it becomes like you smell really noxious smells. And so it makes pollution really immediate, right? So if pollution is a form of slow violence with disease and death that's like on a very large scale, but very diffuse and not really localized, then it becomes very specific for you. It becomes very visceral for you as a gallery goer if you have your head in this toxic cloud. So this is another artist, I think, who's working with or trying to visualize or have us feel slow violence. Here's another one by the Scottish artist Katie Patterson. I do not know how to pronounce this word, Vatnajökull, the sound of. That's the name of a glacier in Iceland. And this work is from 2007 to 2008. So today, it looks different. But what would happen is you would go into a gallery and there was just this neon sign, which you realized was a phone number. And you could call the phone number, and you didn't have to be in the gallery. Anyone in the world could call this number. And on the other line, the phone would pick up, and what you would hear is an underwater microphone with an amplifier of this glacier, of this ecosystem in Iceland melting, right? So you could hear it melting as you're calling on the phone. So this is a really evocative work, which again marries these two forms of ecology that we were talking about. So one is media ecology, right? You'd probably be calling with your iPhone or whatever it is, your Android. You'd be calling and listening to this, so you'd have access to it through this media ecology. You'd have access to this natural ecology that, because of global warming, is melting, and you could hear it immediately melt. So this is another nice example of a work that's trying to tell the story of the slow violence of glacial melt and of greenhouse gases and of global warming in a way that brings it almost like brings it right to your ear, right? It makes it more immediate. Then we come to this well-known work called Tao Does the Right Thing by the Yes Men, which also taps into making visible slow violence, and in such a way that's almost more, not almost, no, definitely more socially engaged as a form of work. So I recommend watching, there's a documentary on them called The Yes Men Fix the World. It's a very fascinating watch, often very funny, but kind of comic tragic at the same time. They do all sorts of different works that are socially engaged, and what they normally do is they'll pose as if they're business people, or they're consultants, or they work in PR or whatever it is. They'll set up a website that looks really legitimate, and then they wait till a media outlet asks them, or a newspaper or something, like asks them to come and give a talk at a conference or on the news or what have you, and then they go on, and then the sort of the fun starts. So in this example, they basically tricked the BBC into thinking that they were with Dow Chemical, who had recently bought a company called Union Carbide that a few decades before committed an environmental disaster in Bhopal in India. So lots of people killed because of this spill. It was a chemical spill, and to this day, this is slow violence, right? So to this day, it's still people are still dealing with the fallout and the diseases and the sickness of this chemical spill. And Union Carbide, and neither Union Carbide nor Dow Chemical, who buys them, ever apologizes or attempts to make much of any reparations for the people that were so afflicted and continue to be afflicted. And so this is a clip of one of the members of the Yes Men going on actual television, on actual BBC, as if he's a spokesperson for Dow, and he says he'll finally accept full responsibility for this disaster, and commits to reparations to the area. And so here's just a clip of this media appearance, and I'll play it for you.
And you're watching BBC World, our main headlines. The world's worst industrial accident is being remembered in India today. It's 20 years since deadly gas leaked from the Union Carbide chemical plant in the city of Bhopal. At least 18,000 deaths are attributed to the leak, and many local people say the contamination has never been properly cleared up.
Yeah. Should I typically just look right into the camera? Okay.
The factory still exists here, and that's been a real problem for the people living here locally. I mean, the site, I've been to it, and it's full of toxic waste. People who are living in these houses, they've all got a story to tell about that day 20 years ago. Many of them lost members of their family, and they say that they're continuing to suffer because of the tragedy. And they're saying somebody needs to answer for this. Legally, what they're saying is that they want to pursue the company to try and clean up the site. But whether the company will accept liability seems doubtful.
Well, joining us live from Paris now is Jude Finisterra. He's a spokesman for Dow Chemicals, which took over Union Carbide. Good morning to you. A day of commemoration in Bhopal. Do you now accept responsibility for what happened?
Steve, yes. Today is a great day for all of us at Dow, and I think for millions of people around the world as well. It's 20 years since the disaster, and today I'm very, very happy to announce that for the first time Dow is accepting full responsibility for the Bhopal catastrophe. We have a $12 billion plan to finally, at long last, fully compensate the victims, including the 120,000 who may need medical care for their entire lives, and to fully and swiftly remediate the Bhopal plant site. Now, when we acquired Union Carbide 3 years ago, we knew what we were getting, and it's worth $12 billion. $12 billion. We have resolved to liquidate Union Carbide, this nightmare for the world and this headache for Dow, and use the $12 billion to adequately compensate the victims.
Jude, that's good news that you have finally accepted responsibility. Some people would say too late. It's 3 years,
Yes.
almost 4 years on.
When we acquired Union Carbide, we did settle their liabilities in the United States immediately. And we are now, 3 years later, prepared to do the same in India. We should have done it 3 years ago. We are doing it now. And I would also like to say that this is no small matter, Steve. This is the first time in history that a publicly owned company of anything near the size of Dow has performed an action which is significantly against its bottom line simply because it's the right thing to do. And our shareholders may take a bit of a hit, Steve, but I think that if they're anything like me, they will be ecstatic to be part of such a historic occasion of doing right by those that we've wronged.
Just to reiterate what Jude Finisterra, the spokesman for Dow Chemicals, has just said, he says Dow Chemicals now fully accept responsibility for the events in Bhopal.
Great. That's it?
Well done.
Great. Now they wanted
Now you do
radio. I can tell you one thing. We're not going out of business. We will continue to make profit. We will simply make slightly less profit than normal. But we are doing the right thing. We're comparing here, though, the value of money to the value of human life, and there is no comparison.
In many ways, it's a remarkable work of socially engaged art and activism, and it's incredible to think that right after this appearance, the stock market plunged for Dow for Dow Chemical. They took a big hit. That is until it was found out that this was not a real spokesperson, that this was an artist. And Dow then calmed the market by saying that this is not actually happening, and the stock went back up. And in a way, when you see him, when you hear him on the radio there in the radio interview saying like there's no context between monetary value and the value of human life, it's as if the artist almost forced the company to go the other way, to admit, yes, we do value stock value over human life, thousands of miles across the globe. So it's a powerful work in that sense, but it's not without issues, and there are certain ethical problems that we might want to talk about and think through. The first being that for a brief moment in time, the people living in Bhopal may have thought that help is actually finally on the way, and that this apology is real, and this sort of restitution from the company was real. So I think it would feel pretty horrible to then realize that actually it wasn't real, that this was an activist work of art on their behalf. The work of art was on their behalf, and yet it would still, I think, would be a very difficult thing to stomach. And so this gets us to the problem of representing and speaking for the other, because whatever the merits are of this work, and I think it is not only a courageous work, but a compelling one, in the way it uses the media ecology in order to address the slow violence of an environmental issue and a multinational corporate issue, and its complicities. So it is an incredible work on the one hand, and yet it does speak for the people in Bhopal, rather than the people in Bhopal speaking for themselves. So there's an element of representing the other. There's a represent of like being a patron of the other, and I think there are issues with that. in Rob Nixon's book, Slow Violence, he quotes Ramachandra Guha and Joan Martinez Allier, and their distinction between full stomach and empty belly environmentalism. And so what they mean by that is, on the one hand, you have environmental organizations and environmental activists who are really well-meaning, but they come from a place of plenty, basically. They have a full stomach, right? They're not, their daily reality is not on the ground of the epicenter of slow violence across the world. Whereas empty belly environmentalists, those that are there, that are feeling the conditions, they do know. And in some ways, then, we might want to think about activists and artists as representing themselves or coming from that place of slow violence in such a way that then it won't be speaking for the other or representing the other. It'll be speaking from that very position, and that could be constructive. And here, then, we unavoidably have to open up the scope of what contemporary art is, because you may have noticed that my first few examples, beginning not with an artist but with a writer, Rachel Carson, and Hans Haacke, Peter de Coopere, Katie Patterson, and now the Yes Men, these are all artists from either the United States or Western Europe, right? So what an incredible benefit to have now a global contemporary art world in which people from all over the place are artists and are represented and can speak through and give and tell stories and narrate the condition of places that are not Western Europe and they're not the United States. And so we're going to end with 3 examples, but there are many different examples that we could bring in of this. And when we get together for the chapter that we're reading this week, those are all examples of environmental art practices that come from non-Western, so-called non-Western geographies, right? So let me just give you a few here. We'll end on these. This is an Indian artist named Ravi Agarwal. He did a series called Alien Waters. He's a photojournalist and documentarian and activist. So he actually, along with his visual practice, and I think this is pretty crucial because now this is not even only representing one's own geography, but it's also doing more than simply representing. It's actually getting politically and economically engaged. He founded an NGO, a non-governmental organization called Toxics Link, which works with local governments, local municipalities, along with the state itself in India, to try to work towards better living conditions and try to fight environmental degradation. So along with this activist NGO work that he does, he also has a photo practice where he documents local living conditions and the lives of people that live at prey to slow violence. And so this is one of many series of his. This one's called Alien Waters, from 2004 to 2006, where he documents the Yamuna River, which is a tributary of the Ganges, and he shows how polluted it is, and how everyday people live on the Ganges. And water is definitely life, right? And there are all sorts of subsistence communities across the world that depend on fresh water sources for sanitation and, of course, for being able to live, to be able to drink and to have clean water. And so if you have industries and if you have pollution and you have toxins littering the water and freshwater sources, you're on the site, you're on the pulse of slow violence in the way we've been articulating today. So this work certainly matches with that, with this definition of slow violence. Here's another one by Bright Ogachukwe Ike. It's called Acid Rain. He's a Nigerian artist, and he was working in Nigeria and it was raining, and he noticed that his skin was starting to burn after just a few days. And so he started to research and ask, like, what's going on here? I mean, it turns out that chemicals from the oil industries in Nigeria, because it's a big place for multinational oil companies to do work, especially, I think, offshore, a lot of offshore drilling. The pollution and the chemicals from the oil refineries get up into the air, and then through rain, through the atmosphere, it comes back down onto the local population. So this too is a form of slow violence, right? This type of acid rain, this rain that's polluted. How do you visualize it? How do you chronicle over time the ill effects it has on people? It's not a sudden trauma, it's this slow, blunt trauma and violence of pollution. And so he did this really quite evocative installation called Acid Rain in 2009. He suspended little bags of water, some of which are filled with pollution, right? So some of them are clean, and some of them have this really dark, sort of soiled quality. And it's an installation, so you walk in and you actually have to get underneath this acid rain, and so there's also sort of this affective, visceral quality of the viewer, of the gallery goer experiencing this work, and then unavoidably wondering what it would be like to live within such conditions of slow violence at the prey of pollution from fossil fuel refineries. And then finally, here's another work by Nyabaleo Odrago called Hell of Copper. He comes from Burkina Faso, and he was actually a world-class athlete. He was a sprinter or a runner for Burkina Faso at the Olympic level, but then he had an injury, and he then decided to become a photographer. And in 2008, he found himself in Accra, the capital of Ghana, where he was covering the African Cup of Nations, so the major sporting event for soccer in Africa. And while he was there, he saw a computer graveyard on the outskirts of Accra. And he started researching this. He documented this. It really is a hellish landscape. It's called Hell of Copper. And he found out that the UN estimates that there are about 50 million tons of waste from computers that litter throughout the world, and you have this whole sort of dystopic landscape in Nigeria of all these computers. This is further complicated by the fact that money can be made off of these hellish defunct computers, because if you go in and burn them down, you can then extricate the copper that's inside of these machines. So there are still valuable metals inside of these old defunct computers, and so there's this whole industry, there's this whole economy, illegal economy, of people going in and burning down computers and then getting the copper and then selling it. And people work there all day, and some children as young as 10 years old spend all day there doing this type of work, likely because it's so difficult to make a living in any other way. So we have a very drastic and very real example of environmental poverty, of slow violence as environmentalism of the poor. Because if the only thing you can do to survive is to burn computers all day long, breathe in toxic fumes, and then sell the resulting copper, you're in very difficult conditions, one in which will lead to all sorts of health effects, deleterious health effects. And the artist talks about how while he was there was one child who died from working there. And so this hooks up to the environmentalism of the poor, this hooks up to slow violence, and the lack of visibility of these kind of places, because at no point, I hardly ever see coverage of the pollution and the littering of electronics in distant places on this planet. That's not something that I normally encounter when I'm reading the news. Other stories have more sensational value. And this work also hooks back up really nicely to what we were talking about before and the media ecology, because what is this if not like a collapse of media ecology, of electronics, of the ways in which people used to use these computers to tap into the media ecology and the digital public sphere, along with of natural ecology, of these landscapes outside of an urban setting in Ghana, littered by these electronics and this trash. And so we sort of end with this work because it brings everything together: the environmentalism of the poor, media ecology, and the slow violence of ecological pollution, and noxiousness, and disease. And I'm going to end with a quote that Rob Nixon begins with in his book, which is a quote by Lawrence Summers, who back then, this is in 1991, he's an economist who's still working today. He became, I think, the president of Harvard later on, someone with a certain amount of power in society. So Lawrence Summers in 1991, he gave this quote. Actually, it was a confidential memo from his job at the World Bank. And Rob Nixon quotes this at the beginning of his book, and we're going to end with this quote. And so what does Lawrence Summers say? He says, quote, "I think the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and we should face up to that. I've always thought that countries in Africa are vastly underpolluted. Their air quality is probably vastly inefficiently low compared to Los Angeles. Just between you and me, shouldn't the World Bank be encouraging more migration of the dirty industries to the least developed countries?" And so what is he saying here? He's saying that he thinks that environmentally, African countries can take pollution, and we should be dumping our pollution there because they can take it, because it's more it's more pristine there than it is in Los Angeles or so-called developed urban centers. And he says, he follows up this quote by saying that this is killing two birds with one stone, because not only will companies be able to deal with their waste, but because it's going to be out of sight from developed countries, that environmentalists will then also be happy, because the urban centers in developed countries will be cleaner. It won't have to deal with this type of pollution. But notice what he's forgetting, and notice what he's leaving out. And notice what he seemingly does not seem to care about, is what Nyabaleon Odreago is documenting in Hell of Copper, that Africa is not the dump of the West, right? That people live there, and that they deal with this type of violence. And so this type of thinking that which really I think has to do with a certain amount of privilege and entitlement of someone like a Lawrence Summers, I think it points to a type of structural form of thinking and a type of structural violence, which is related to slow violence, because this isn't violence of going to war and hurting people directly. This is a type of violence where it's indirect, where you assume that a place like a city in Ghana is expendable, and can be the dump site for the more privileged societies and their used and now defunct electronics. So this is really depressing stuff. In many ways, this was a difficult session to prepare, because a lot of the works that I show are very symptomatic of what's very wrong, of the Lawrence Summers type of Lawrence Summers type of thinking. And so one of the things I'd like us to do going forward, because every session is integrated with and builds off of itself, I'd like to think of works that offer not just symptoms of these horrible problems that we're facing, but also works that point towards better futures and solutions, and doing away with this kind of structural slow violence that those who are very powerful still seem to ignore or just assume.